Audre Lorde said we were never meant to survive as a people or a culture with an identity as other than the null space of less than. I added the last part onto that. Freedom colonies and the Black life they represent defies that in important ways. And let's talk about this in relationship to Wheatville and the area north of North Austin. Black population of Austin has been in free fall for, well, since just after the years of Reconstruction. I think the last point on here is what, 2010, 8%. We're probably at 7 or 6 at this point. So the theme of this get together is freedom colonies in urban areas. And freedom colonies in urban areas, particularly in a place like Austin, Texas, are going the way of all Black folks in a place like Austin, Texas. Right? In other words, we are being disappeared as opposed to just disappearing. I'm particularly interested in the area north of 18th Street, AKA Martin Luther King Boulevard, excuse me, in Austin, Texas. And I'm interested in it because one of the things as a faculty member, as a Black faculty member at the University of University of Austin, University of Texas at Austin, it's only been 35 years, is that the University of Texas has played a major role in the disappearance of what was essentially a Black space before the institution was created. So we're not only talking about Wheatville, which back in 1880 was a Black freedom colony improbably created on high land above Shoal Creek and on white-owned property. In other words, white folks owned this whole area and Black folks managed to arrive on the scene, inhabit, and purchase and create Black life in this area. It's a big deal. So to Andrea's point, Dr. Roberts' point, sorry, earlier, right? We weren't only on marginal lands, we were also on choice territory, many times to our own, I don't know what you call it, demise. But anyway, Wheatville, there's a Black community before the university starts up on what's called now East Campus on Lampasas North Speedway. There's also Wheeler's Grove, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then there's all this Blackness in horse pastures. And by the time you get to 1910, there's also a large Black presence of what's called Blacklands. So this is a whole swath of Blackness in a space that's north of Austin, but on the highlands between basically Waller Creek and Shoal Creek. This is a 1887 bird's eye of basically Wheatville. This, for future reference, I'm going to talk about it, is the Neil Cochran House, which is important mansion built by enslaved people. Right. This is the community of Wheatville in 1880. By the time we get to around 1910, you'll see that the community has expanded north up to here and almost all the way out to, this here is Rio Grande. right? But it's a relatively big community, even in 1880, because we're talking about small populations in general. The point I want to make about this whole area is that it is an area of Black life. It's Black life being created from the Holocaust of slavery, loaded from, let's call them the depths of slavery. In other words, people who are understood to be subhuman, non-human, chattel, overnight become people, and we always were, right? And we knew it, but we now have a chance to make our lives. And in these freedom colonies, that's what we do. And if you look at even a place like Wheatville, people have come from all over the South, mostly dragged as enslaved people by their masters trying to avoid the end of the Civil War and the loss of their property, but nevertheless from all over the South, and creating a community, thank you, that has a wide variety, even according to the census, of occupations that are associated both with creating and maintaining a semi-autonomous, self-contained community, as well as service to the larger Austin community. So these folks are making Black life. They're making a Black life that is not completely separated from the white folks, right? But now we have a chance to create something that is us. And this is what's going on in freedom colonies in Austin and throughout Texas. And as Dr. Roberts is now showing us, I don't know, throughout California, who knew, throughout the South at least, right? This is important. These are Black families, right? Often extended families. This is an 1875 Austin city census. And if you look closely, you'll see Jacob Fontaine's name there. His people have already talked about him a little bit, but this is a compound family in the sense that Jacob, who we'll talk about in a little bit, is his daughter is living with his family, Melissa Fontaine Gordon, married to Joe Gordon, who's a brick hodder, carries bricks, helps make bricks, et cetera, et cetera. Here's Melissa here. The point being that to what we were just talking about before, Black women played a key role in creating this community and creating Black life, which is basically created around the domestic relations created in these communities. Melissa is important also because it's her daughter Violet and her grand nieces who ultimately sell off her property to one of her daughter's employers in the mid 1970s. And it's she's one of the last, that family is one of the last homeowners in what was the freedom colony of Wheatville. She's also important because her father, and undoubtedly she herself, as well as her husband, helped to produce a Black newspaper in Wheatville, which is a big deal, the Gold Dollar, right? This is the only extant copy that I've ever seen. The archivist here, maybe no others, right? But this is making Black life. Having a school is making Black life. Having teachers, right? This woman here is listed as a mulatta, but she's part of the Wheatville community as a teacher, all right? This is Rat Harbin out in front of her house. This is the only photo that I've ever been able to find of a structure in Wheatville outside of the Gold Dollar building. And this, we have, Tara Dudley couldn't be here with us, and I and a guy by the name of Joe Horn have tried to reconstruct how it is that they constructed this home, looking at the architecture, but also looking back at the receipts and the loans they took with the lumber mills in order to be able to construct the building, et cetera, et cetera. This is constructed by the folks in Wheatville making Black life. By the time we get to 1910, Wheatville is a big community, almost 500 people, very extensive. And then something begins to happen. We've got someone here who I just talked to this morning who's writing a master's thesis about this, because as he says, we usually think about the 1928 plan in which the city decided that it needed to create one Negro district, which meant that all those freedom colonies on the periphery of Austin needed to disappear and be consolidated on the east side of what's now I-35. But it turns out that the Black population of a place like Wheatville was declining even before that, actually, and before white folks began to gentrify and move in. White folks, Black folks, 1910, 1920. Interestingly, the number of Black households in Wheatville in 1910 and 1920 are just about the same, but the population reduces by a third. What does that mean? It means things like the pandemic. It means things like World War I, flu pandemic, World War I, the increase, the nadir of anti-Black violence in the South, and particularly in Texas and in Austin, right? Had people moving north, and a number of other kinds of things that we don't yet understand took place, so that Black folks began to move out of at least the households of Wheatville, such that by the time you get to 1940, we're down to almost nothing. And into this space moves the University of Texas at Austin, not by out and out buying the property, but by working with the city to change the zoning rules such that multi-family or multi-person housing could be created there, particularly fraternities and sororities. So this map, created by Eshawn Gordon Garth, shows 1920, the white dots are fraternities. So you can see in 1920, Wheatville, at least in terms of household, is still more or less intact. And fraternities are concentrated to the west and north of the university and a little bit to the south. By the time you get to 1960, there's 3 families of Black folks left, and it's Fraternity Row. And Wheatville here's the remnants of it, now famous. It's called the Gold Dollar Building. I have a hard time with that. I still call it the Franzetti Building. Why? Because George Franklin, I'm going to go on too long. So Sarita, you yank me off of here when you need to get me out of here, right? So, because I can go on forever. At any rate, a Black carpenter by the name of George Franklin probably created the base of this, but the rest of it is created by various white, Italian, grocers and other folks. The Fontaine crew probably rented it for a while, but the Gold Dollar newspaper was created to I'll show you this right here. One of my most important factoids. This is where the Gold Dollar, am I doing something wrong? Okay. This is where the Gold Dollar newspaper was created. That's Jacob Fontaine's house there. It's not in what's called the Gold Dollar Building. How do we know? Because we know that Jacob Fontaine's house, which contained the Gold Dollar newspaper, was burned to the ground by arsonists in 1876. This is the old site of Melissa Gordon's house. This is the last extant structure of Wheatsville. The Gold Dollar newspaper was published Black life erased. This is Mahela Murchison Strain. Anybody know who Mahela Murchison Strain was? I know my Austin Amen crowd over here knows who she is. All right. She is supposed to have been the first Black person to live in Austin, Texas. Hey, it's a long story. I won't go into that and all that. But why is she important for this particular narrative? My next slide is a picture of her son, Frank Strain. Why are they important for this? They're important for this because Frank Strain and his mother came from Cedar Creek to Austin around 1870. And Frank got a piece of property at what's now 26th and Speedway. And so, sorry. And so he builds a house for himself and he brings his mom up, and it is the last resident that Mahela Murchison Strain lived in, basically. Why is that important? Because it's now under concrete at the University of Texas at Austin. As is a whole, if I were able to show it to you, a whole series of Black households, some of which are underneath the new aeronautics engineering building, some of which are underneath the Winship building. In other words, the University of Texas campus east of the old 40 acres basically is built upon what were Black households. And then when we get our visuals back, you'll also see that between the Wheatville folks and the Black community in what's now the East Campus of the University of Texas, and another set of folks, Black folks who are living in what was called horse pasture, there were the focus of Black life to the extent that they, in their area, were the folks who basically hosted the Juneteenth celebrations in Wheeler's Grove from sometime, I heard 1867 this morning. I have proof from the early 1870s, right through when the property was sold to the Wesleyans in about 1908, right? So Wheeler's Grove, all right, let me catch up. Frank, here's his house, here's his family and his daughters. His daughters and his sons end up marrying and building houses just to the south of him. This is a picture, this up here. Now this isn't working. Oh, help me. Anyway, what I was pointing to up there was a Black community in that area. Here we go again. I won't do anything. I'm not going to touch anything more. This is, if you see the red dots here, you can see various Black households in the vicinity of the University of Texas. And this is the cement that I was talking about that now covers them on one of the expressions of it. What I was talking about was Wheeler's Grove, and these are now famous pictures of Wheeler's Grove taken by a photographer, actually a graduate University of Texas, a woman in 1900. These are now almost world famous because they're the best photographs of Juneteenth celebrations from the early 20th century. Where did this take place? This took place, if you know the University of Texas at Austin, it took place under this parking garage. And as I'll show you, it took place under a dormitory. All right, this was the major site for the celebration of Emancipation Day for 30 years by Black people making Black life. To top it off, we know that social memory is a key aspect of making citizenship. And it's important to folks. Why do we know it's important to folks? Because people who have power over and over and over create the symbols that help us and guide our social memory of our past. This is the Neil Cochran House, run by the colonial dames. My colleague Tara here, you know, if she were here, works with them. They have this, well, I said I wouldn't use a pointer again, but anyway, they have an old slave quarters in the back here. They've done really good interpretive history, et cetera, but nevertheless, this is the colonial dames commemorating whose history? This is the Kappa Alpha House in central Wheatville. Confederate Gray. Georgian neoclassical Greek revival architecture. Recalling and commemorating what? Their founder or their founding image is Robert E. Lee. Right in the heart of Wheatville. What are they commemorating? What kind of history are they talking about? This is one of the UT buildings that is placed directly over what would have been Frank and Mahala Strains and their descendants' houses, named after Jim Bob Moffett. You probably don't remember who he is, but he was a key figure in the whole Circle C controversies in Austin, Texas about development in fight with Save Our Springs, et cetera, and also one of the chief movers of Freeport McMahon, which was doing mountaintop removal in New Guinea and killing local indigenous opposition. And then, of course, on our picnic grounds, Wheeler's Grove, we have a dormitory named after a Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, William Simpkins. These folks know what they're doing in terms of commemoration and social memory, which celebrates Black life. Why is it important to them? Because memory is key. This here is also another picture of another part of Wheeler's Grove, which is now fenced off, and it's a staging ground for construction across Waller Creek there, right? Sacred ground to some, staging ground for other things for others. Why is this all important? In our society, and in fact, worldwide, rights are vested in nation-like identities. In other words, if you have an identity that is associated with a particular place or territory that is created around a certain set of people who are understood to be in one way or another biologically related, right? Genealogically, blood, basically. Blood and earth, blood and land, whatever that is. And also an autochthonous and authentic culture that is said to emerge from that, you have a nation-like identity, all right? And nation-like identities are the basis for national demands. The French, the Chinese, the Italians, even the Nigerians. These are the kinds of claims that are basis for making claims to sovereignty and rights. And social memory, right, of these kinds of bases for making claims are key to the reproduction of those kinds of identities and those kinds of claims to rights. This country right now is engaged in a struggle over who gets to make those claims. There are a lot of folks who want to claim that the people who get to make the claim to be Americans and to have rights as Americans here are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And the commemorative sites that I showed you before that are placed on or near the previous sites of Black life in Austin, Texas, are the basis for making, one of the many bases for making these kinds of claims, or can be. So why is the work that you all are doing, that we're doing in relationship to Freedom Colonies, so important? In part, because they are creating or helping to create or maintain social memory of Black life, which becomes the basis for a nation-like identity, an association of people with territory and culture. It's the attempt to create social or cultural citizenship in a multicultural democracy. Dr. Roberts talked about PolicyLink. PolicyLink is doing a lot of work on this notion of multicultural democracy and the need for it. Why? Because it's under threat. Our work, as I see it, is the maintenance, the encouragement, and in some places like Wheatville, the restoration of social memory as reparative justice. I think reparative is spelled wrong here, but forgive me. And from my perspective, that's the job of commemoration writ large. It's the job that Dr. Roberts is already involved in. It's the job that Hannah Michaels is involved in, and Stephanie Lang, and I'm sure all the rest of y'all. I think it should be broadly conceptualized. I think that there needs to be aesthetic representation in commemoration. It has to be representation of a public history which is drawn from the perspective of the people and the community themselves. It needs to be pedagogical because we have to draw people into an understanding, a recognition of distinctive social memories. It needs to be backed by good scholarly research and publication, as Dr. Roberts and others in this room have done. And as Hannah Michael was pointing out to us, the archive is everything. But what the archive is too narrowly defined and has been defined by others, not our communities. And our social memory is dependent on those archives, broadly construed. And so we need community archives in order to be the foundation of this reparative work. Thanks.